Hello, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Distinguished Lecture hosted by Gallaudet University. Welcome to those here in the auditorium and to those live streaming from across the country. This lecture series aims to honor world-renowned scientists in the fields of psychology, education, cognitive sciences, and neuroscience. These different fields and all the interdisciplinary fields in between contribute to the new and growing field of educational neuroscience. They increase our understanding of the human mind and the neural mechanism of learning. This year's Distinguished Lecture Series theme is From Mirror Neurons to Society, How the Brain and Experience Provide New Insights into Learning. With our distinguished lectures in the heart of DC, we want to build bridges across fields and scientific communities in the area and across the nation. Everyone is welcome. Dr. Supalla is the last of our lectures this academic year. We are delighted and honored to have Dr. Supalla accept our invitation. Professor Dr. Ted Supalla received his degree in experimental psychology from the University of California, San Diego, where he specialized in psycholinguistics under the supervision of Dr. Ursula Bellugi of the Salk Institute. After receiving his PhD, he worked at different universities, University of Illinois Champaign, as well as University of Rochester, and now is here at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., in the neurology, psychology, and linguistics department. Dr. Supalla has been involved in sign language research since he started working as a research assistant in the 70s, teaching signs to chimpanzees. Today, he is internationally recognized for his scholarly work and expertise on sign modality, touching on many fields, from neuroscience to linguistics and technology. He's also a strong advocate of his mother language, American Sign Language, as a heritage language, working toward the development and preservation of ASL for future generations of humanity. His current research focuses on the use of historical archives of ASL stored to examine possible historical factors that influence structural changes in ASL, including cognition, technology, and ideas. His investigations aim to answer questions about the universals of language in the human mind, brain, and body. He shared his findings through his book titled Sign Language Archaeology, Understanding Historical Roots of American Sign Language. Also in ASL articles in Deaf Studies Digital Journal. And from these, he created a massive online course called Sign Language Structure, Learning, and Change. Today, we will learn, his talk today is sponsored by the William H. and Ruth Crane Schaefer Endowment. Today, we will learn more about Dr. Supalla's research on factors influencing the development of sign language grammar across generations and experiences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ted Supalla. Thank you for being here.
Lauren, can you hear me okay? Or is this still? Hi, everyone. So we are at neighboring universities. Oh, looks like there's some commotion right here down front. I am delighted to talk about new research that I've been engaged in. I feel like every place I go, I end up doing something new, so that seems to be a pattern of mine. Today I'll be talking to you about diachronicity of the signer's mental lexicon. And I'll start by emphasizing or describing the mental lexicon. By this, I mean not just our vocabulary or what's listed in a dictionary. What's in our minds is organized quite differently. It's not organized alphabetically like we see in dictionaries, and so the exact nature of the mental lexicon has been the subject of a good deal of discussion in the field. And I think one way that we can understand our mental lexicon is by using diachronicity. So obviously, chronicity has a reference to time, but diachronicity really means that I'm looking at a great length of time so that we can see how our mental lexicon has changed over time. So to first understand the mental lexicon that may have existed in signers' minds a century ago, because we sometimes forget that the language that we have documented from 100 years ago was really produced by someone that had their own mental lexicon. So it's an amazing feature of human language that we're able to pass on language across generations, and our job is to try to understand how exactly that's done. So I'm revisiting the process of grammaticalization in signed languages by looking at language over time. Grammar has not stayed the same across centuries. The grammar stays the same across centuries in many spoken languages, while the vocabulary changes. And as I've compared these notions to sign language, I've really been given a new lens now on understanding sign language over time. And it has really radically shifted how I understand sign language in the last 10 years. So I'd like to share some of these thoughts and findings with you. And of course, there are many things that have come from this new perspective. I'm only going to share one aspect of this new perspective that I have, and that is as it relates to the lexicon. So one way that we can investigate a signer's mental lexicon from over a century ago comes from written records and illustrations. This is an illustration of a sign that was used to describe this object pictured here. And the fact that this sign was chosen for this dictionary is an indication that this sign may have been fairly standard and used by a great number of people. Now, another thing that you can derive from this, or get from this, is that this person may have been talking about the concrete object of a hat, but we also see a similar entry used in a more abstract way. So this sign is chosen in this dictionary not only to reference an actual object of a hat, but the brim of the hat seems to have been used by the community in a more abstract way. So not only does it mean hat, it can also mean the action of donning a hat, like this person is doing in the illustration on the right. So all of a sudden, this one sign takes on two meanings. And this doesn't seem to be problematic in language communities to have single forms or similar forms that are used to indicate different meanings. Let's take another look at exactly what this form meant. I forgot to mention, by the way, that the illustration that I just showed you was from a book that was published in 1834. You saw me correctly, it was 1834. Having a publication from so long ago is a great asset to us. And not only is it an asset because of its age, but it's also an asset because there's illustrations of signs and movements, or in other words, the form of signs, which is continued in later publications. We have an example here of the form for home, which was a compound of eat and sleep. So this tells us that two signs can be used in conjunction with each other to mean something. So the example I just gave you was of a single sign, but we now see that multiple forms can be used in conjunction with each other for a new word. So this also informs us about the signer's mental lexicon, because it's not only storing individual items, it's also storing combinations of items to result in new meanings. Then this form that you see on the far right, which is understood as home, while it was originally a compound of eat and sleep, over time it can be reanalyzed and viewed as just a single lexical item of home. But it helps us to understand the history of our language and also the history of one's mental lexicon. And so we have to keep in mind that the mental lexicon that may have been used a century or two ago can be quite different than the one that we have today, because the mental lexicon also evolves in accordance with the community. This is also what we see in spoken languages, that the mental lexicon changes over time. Many of us know, many in the signing community know, that French Sign Language was a predecessor of American Sign Language, so there is a historical relationship between ASL and LSF. And the exact nature of what's left in ASL from LSF is a bit debatable, but it is apparent that how people thought about and understood and shared sign language with other people in French Sign Language was also passed on through American Sign Language. Here's an illustration of the same image that I showed you from the 1834 publication. And I've labeled this as both depiction and a piece of morphology. So in its initial sense, it was depicting a physical object and an action that would be carried out on that object. It then gave way to several other forms because it was productively used in other signs. For that reason, I've labeled this also as morphology. So this helps us to understand that a single sign form can be used in multiple ways and generate multiple meanings. This indicates a shift in meaning, not just a shift in form, but a shift in form then creates a change in meaning. And this process of a shift in form creating a change in meaning is often referred to as metaphorization. So something that was originally a reference to something in the real world can be used in a metaphorical way. And in this way, the form takes on multiple meanings and is polysemous. So it's an indication of metaphorization and polysemy. This is why we need to understand signs over time, because we see in this one example that gestural forms for the concrete concept of hat can also be used in an abstract way. This one sign or gesture came to represent the abstract concept of male. So someone who's new to the language might strictly see it in concrete terms, in places where really it's used as an abstraction for the concept of male. And we saw that this was already being used for this abstract concept of male in 1834. This happens naturally as languages change. It happens in spoken language and it's referred to as metaphor. And you can use this as an example for when people ask about metaphor in signed languages. Let's return to the publication by Czech. That's the author's name. He had gone to the School for Deaf Students in Paris, learned what was called the French method. He lived in Austria, so he returned to his home country and created a book of illustrations for the signs that he had seen used in Paris. All of these illustrations were on a single page. Let's explore what the relationship was of this sequence of signs. You see on the far left there is an entry for hat, the object, but then we also see it in other entries where the hat is not referenced. In the third image, we see a man tailoring clothes and a woman also doing some domestic activity at a table. It turns out that this same form was used to reference marriage or spouses, husband and wife. So these are very old forms that we still see in our language today. And I was surprised even to see that in 1834, the language had evolved such that they were already using forms in abstract ways. In the final illustration, we see an infant. So this form for male was also used to refer to one's son. And it was also used to refer to ancestors, which you see in the portrait illustrated here on the far right panel. One couldn't simply make reference to male. It would create ambiguity or confusion in the signing community. So clarification was created by adding other forms. And then this gave way to having signs for relatives like grandfather. So polysemy was resolved, and any ambiguity was resolved by adding other forms to create phrases or strings that would make one's meaning clear and differentiate the form from how it was used in other instances. So maybe this sort of compilation of signs into phrases is what was actually meant by the French method of creating new words. And in this example, we see what the French method was for making kinship terms. Now, if anyone in the audience is questioning how it is that I came to this conclusion, it's from a great deal of research that went into the publication of sign language archaeology, which was published by Gallaudet University Press, along with my co-author, Patricia Clark. Patricia started out as an interpreter working with me. She came to later be a research assistant and eventually a co-author. She is, her parents are deaf, so she is a coda. And we settled on the term archaeology for our book because this truly was like an excavation. We had to do a great deal of exploration in archives and in uncovering historical resources that were really neglected. Now, of course, this isn't the only thing that we have available as a resource. I also have to extend thanks to the National Association of the Deaf for commissioning films to be made 100 years ago. All of these films have been digitized and are available online. The actual physical film footage is available here in the Gallaudet archives, but we've also digitized them and glossed each item and counted the forms in the films. We also have an inventory of 3 contemporaneous books. So we have one from Long, Higgins, and Michaels that were published around the same time as the films were made. So this helps us to understand what American Sign Language looked like 100 years ago. We cataloged the films and the books with who the authors were, who the signers were, so there's also a great deal of metadata available as a part of the database. The reason that we included those 3 contemporaneous books was because it can be really a tricky thing to try to interpret what we see in these films from a present-day stance. What we know about language today might lead us to misinterpret what was said in the films from 100 years ago, because we know that language and meanings change. So we had to rely a great deal on these books that had vocabulary of signs that were used at the same time the films were made. I'll show you a few examples of footage from the Historical Sign Language database. Now, let's go back to kinship terminology. so that I can give you an example of what we see in the film footage from the NAD and how these terms from 100 years ago still exist in present-day ASL. Let's start on the far right of the screen because it will be a more familiar sign to those of you in the room today. What we think of today as sun did not have the same form as it was expressed 50 years ago or 100 years ago. I have still images here from the film just so that you can see more clearly what the segments of the sign were. Excuse me. Now, not only did having the books help us understand the films also helped us understand the books. Because, of course, still drawings of a sign form can't always be 100% well interpreted from just a flat drawing. So the film footage helped us understand even the drawing that was produced by Watson in 1964. I'll reenact the form for you here. Again, Watson's illustrations are from about 50 years ago. You see that having son or daughter, the sign for son or daughter was still two-part. I was certainly signing back in 1964, but I can't recall if this was exactly how I signed son or daughter. Now we know that when words appear in sentences in new ways, it really is the result of discourse and how people communicate and make sure that they're mutually intelligible. As people come to conventionalize how they use words in certain orders, then that means they've shifted to syntax. So as languages evolve, they go from discourse principles of organization to syntactic principles, and those syntactic principles then lead to paradigms that govern how words are formed. And when I say paradigm, it's another word for saying that there are principles or rules to how we form words and how you use different signs in a patterned way. So we see examples of signing from the early 1900s that was already being used in a syntactic way, so they were already at this stage of language evolution. Certainly, something discursive was a predecessor to that. That may have been what existed in French Sign Language, but this syntactic way of communicating about kinship terms was imported to the United States. And Edward Minor Gallaudet may have seen his father, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, using signs in a more discursive way. Also, mind you, at the time Edward Minor Gallaudet was filmed, he was already 70 years old. So he had seen people much older than him for many years and people much younger than him for many years. When we look to documentation about French Sign Language at the time, it's confirmed that this paradise was in use even then. Pellicier's 1856 publication, which was a dictionary, also shows this same rule for forming kinship terms. So you would combine a gender marker with a reference to one's age or relationship, which would then give us son or daughter. He shows that these lexical phrases were used in France for some time, but eventually disappeared. And the reason we can say that they have disappeared is that signers of current French Sign Language don't use these same forms. However, we see them in American Sign Language. So this is an example of what I mean by our mental lexicon. There is some permanence when a form continues to be used, but because it's no longer in the mental lexicons of signers in France now, we can say that that form has disappeared. Signs can also undergo further changes. They can undergo cliticization, in which a segment of a sign only remains as a clitic, which is a very small feature in language. And in fact, gender markers now are cliticized in modern ASL kinship terms. We see it in the forms for brother and sister. I'll give you examples of these illustrations. You see how I'm starting either at my forehead or at my chin. That starting location is originally because of gender that was initially used. We now don't form the gender marker as a complete sign, but there is a remnant solely in location, which indicates that it is a cliticized version of the gender marker that is also a remnant of what we saw in French Sign Language in the 1800s as full references to something that began as a concrete reference to the brim of one's hat or a ribbon on one's bonnet. In their full forms, they may have referred to a person, so a man or a woman. But here, in these illustrations, it's not clear. It's not as clear as it would have been if these signs were referring to the actual person. So you can see that they've already undergone some change when they're being used as a compound. Now, mind you, the sequence of starting out with the gender marker and then referring to the kinship is an important point. This leads me to challenge those who say that sign languages or signs are simultaneous. What we see here, in fact, is that there is a sequence that remains visible in our language today. I think that there is a certain drive to understand sign languages as simultaneous because of its modality, but then that can lead us to overlook other features of signed languages that are not simultaneous. I would argue that morphology can also be sequential, or it is also referred to as concatenative. So concatenative morphology refers to the concatenation of different morphemes or using them in sequence in a certain order. So this is how we see that sun, even though today it feels like a single sign, is actually has two parts to it and is the remnant of what was once a compound. Now, why is it that gender occurs in the beginning? Is it that the clitic, if there is one in a sign, always occurs first? We see another example of a clitic, which is negation. I'll show you an example of these three illustrations that I have up here on the right. Today, for expressing the concept of don't know, you can use the sign not. But 100 years ago, negation, the form of negation looked different, and it had to be placed after a verb. So it was a post-verbal negation that eventually changed into what we now see as a single sign for don't know. We no longer understand it as a two-part sign, but it was a sequential two-part sign 100 years ago, and it's no longer apparent to modern day signers, which is fine. We don't have to know everything about our language to use it. People use their languages all day around the world without understanding how exactly it is that they came to know those languages or how they work, yet can use them quite fine. This that I'm referring to is opacity, which is a contrast to iconicity. Iconicity has been given a great deal of attention in sign language research, but I would argue it's high time to also start looking at opacity in sign languages, particularly in modern polywords. What I'm referring to here are signs that used to be multiple signs and used to be phrasal that now feel like single signs, but really is a combination of multiple segments. So these are polywords that have been reduced over time and may even have clitics. Now, there are other forms of negation, like this. We see this sign as the form never, without even realizing that it was once a compound word. It was a combination of always and then the gesture for not this. Now, how do you sign bad? Let me see in the audience. It was from good and again this negation. When we look at documentation of French Sign Language, we have found examples of bad and good. The illustration for bad was very surprising to me to see, because we still use this form in American Sign Language, but we no longer take it to mean bad. Instead, we understand that sign to mean worse or worst. So this indicates that this was a form that was very likely in use at the turn of the century, or the turn of the 20th century, but because we also had the option to negate a form by having the not this gesture, the sign from French Sign Language that meant bad could then be used in a different way. We started to use that one to mean worse. So this was a breakthrough for me, and having this new lens allowed me to understand sign languages in new ways, and it gave me some clues for how to understand what I was seeing and to explain forms of new knowledge that we have about our lexicon and our grammar. And I again need to point to the fact that having this documentation of words and having glossing of the illustrations were immensely helpful, as was having film footage. This allowed us to cross-reference different sources and different people. Again, we see patterned sequencing in how signs were formed. We also saw how how the forms changed over time, because there were signers of different ages that were captured on film in the early 1900s. The sequencing remained the same regardless of a signer's age, which meant that the sequencing was patterned and governed the position of the clitics. Now, the rest of this presentation relays the gist of my research regarding linguistic and cognitive scaffolds. I'm referring to scaffolds because there is something that we have in our mind that is able to store these sequences and patterns. So this indicates that we have the capacity to understand patterns, and that's what is passed on from generation to generation. So I don't think it's always the case that sign languages remain iconic and are simultaneous early in their lifetimes. So that's why I've made it a point here to show that I think that really we are looking at cognitive and linguistic scaffolds that have really supported the mental lexicon over time. One way of testing this is by doing verbatim recall tasks. This was a psycholinguistic experiment. I am trained as a psycholinguist and regard myself also as a historian and have expertise in creating stimulus material for different types of experiments. So I worked with a few collaborators on a verbatim recall task. We created a number of stimulus sentences and asked participants to repeat the sentences exactly as they were formed. They don't have to think about what they meant. They just needed to replicate the form exactly as it was presented. Seems easy enough, right? We would start out with short sentences and end up with target sentences like the one you see here, which was composed of 6 signs. And while 6 might seem like a small number in and of itself, there was a great deal of complexity in each of the lexical items. For example, the final sign was glossed as trees go by, and it looked like this. So that's why you see the hyphenated glossing of trees go by. You also see the same forms in Stokey notation on the second line. And a sample response might be correct on a number of items, but wrong in one, as you see here indicated by the red X. And what we often saw from participants were changes. They would sometimes take a target sign that was one form and split it into 2. So trees go by was what was in the target sentence, but a participant sometimes would sign go by and tree separately. When I looked back at the target sentence, I saw that actually those 2 forms were combined. So we see that there's something about their recall that indicates what it is that they're understanding from what they're seeing. So it's not that they're actually storing the visual form of trees go by, they're storing the meanings of them. They're storing some sort of pattern, and that's what's important. We have internal cognitive mechanisms that sort of take care of parsing and understanding input. Now, despite the fact that each of these 3, that this utterance was marked as incorrect on the task, we see that the types of errors that people made were very patterned. And sometimes the errors that we recorded showed that there was actually serialization happening in how they understood the target sentences. This work was done, the citation disappeared, but this work was done with the assistance of with Metley. We also see the freezing of forms in lexicalization. So, for example, we saw the reference to the brim of a hat. As that form was frozen, then it could be used in productive ways to be used in different forms. The sign that was glossed as trees go by would be very difficult to put in a dictionary because it has so many components to it. So it's something that certainly exists in a signer's mind as something that they can understand because they understand what could give way to that form, but still it wouldn't be stored in a dictionary. Another example is signs that we gloss as survey or test. There is some variation in how each of these are produced. And I found in doing this historical research that often the sign for many would come after a noun. So this is what gives rise to the 2 variations that we currently have for test. So I now have a new way of understanding this form that I've used my entire life and didn't think much of, because this form became frozen and I no longer understood it as a compound. Now I also, who uses this form for test? Am I really the only one? I can't be. Okay, I see a couple more. No, I don't have a lateral movement at all in how I'm forming it. I'm only going downward. Does anyone? All right, good. Just you and me. A lot of other people just have a downward movement, and it's not a multiple repeated downward movement. It's one movement that extends for the entire, the index finger moves during the entire downward movement. This is a change that could have been predicted because the form for the plural marker, or many, was dropped. I've also seen question, or the sign, the form for question used productively in a sign for survey. It's glossed as survey. So we see that forms get frozen at different stages in their evolution, and this can give way to dialectal variation or geographic variation because it depends at which point that sign became frozen in that dialect or in that area. Now, I was really interested in the content of these 3 books that had been published around the time the NAD films were made. Does anyone use this sign, or has anyone seen it? And if so, what does it mean? Okay, I see some guesses of grandmother around the room. That's great, because you're wrong. It actually used to mean mother. Then this was father. How did you know, though, that it could mean grandmother or grandfather? Because there used to be a repeated movement, a repeated backward movement to refer to previous generations. This was documented in the Michaels book, which was published in 1923. This form was used in the 1800s, but in the publication from 1923 that was published by Higgins, it had already come to be understood as mother. Now, even though the books were contemporaneous, the authors were of different ages, and they had learned different versions then of ASL. So even though the books were the same age, the mental lexicon that they're describing was different, and this is an indication of diachronicity of our language, that the forms still are alive and well, still today. We just have new ways of understanding them. Also, as I explored the books more carefully, I understood that the ages of the authors, of course, contributed to some variation that we saw in the dictionary. Also, Michaels and Long were both deaf, and there was a good number of entries in their dictionaries that were composed of compound signs or phrasal forms indicated by the bluish-purple bar. But in the Higgins book, he's hearing, and he was a later learner of sign language, almost all of his entries were of singular forms, having single word correspondences between ASL and English. Now, in the interest of time, I wanted to turn my attention to how it is that this can shed light on how people use language today. I think that different dialects can still use the same lexicon. So we can choose one place to understand, one geographic area to understand the mental lexicon. And in order to elicit different lexical items, I needed to have a consistent word list to use, at least for now. So we decided to use a very well-known, well-used word list, the Swadesh word list, which has been in use in comparative linguistics for at least 100 years. Initially, it was used to study European languages, to identify language families, and to understand how one language gave way to another, so to understand the typology of spoken languages in Europe. I figured that we could use the same approach to understanding sign languages, and in fact this has been done in the past to using this Swadesh word list. So I decided to also use it, and you would have to start by using it among people that use the same dialect. So I identified a group of people that went to the same school in order to see if there was agreement and consistency in the forms that they would use in response to the Swadesh word list. I chose Iowa to do this field work, sent a research assistant to go collect data from approximately 30 to 40 people. And for each of those participants that came in, if they had deaf relatives, we also asked that they come and participate as well, so that we had multi-generational or data from people across multiple generations of one family. Now, one of the books was also published in Iowa, so that meant that we had documentation of the language that was used there 100 years ago. J. Schuyler Long had gone to Gallaudet University and then returned to Iowa to set up the school there. He went on to become the principal of the school, so he was a very prominent figure in that community. Some of our participants from the Iowa group were not from multi-generationally deaf families. We know that deafness is not always genetic, and so we know that it's not always passed down from parent to child. But still, we were able to get data from these participants and look at families where it was available to us. You would expect to see their lexicon reflect a form of a collective memory, especially if people were peers. You would expect that they were exposed to similar language and that they would continue to use that language in their community with those who were younger than them. Now, you would also expect that as people respond to these, if they had met deaf people many generations older than them, then that meant that their collective memory extended back further than their own lifetime. Now, how far back could one go? There are procedures to start to investigate this. What we ultimately found was that people often use signs that are not the same ones that older people had used, and they wouldn't remember those older forms, even though they may have actually seen them. Now, we saw this actually with the participants from Iowa. This is my favorite example. The entry from Long's 1918 publication for wolf is described as making reference to fangs and the muzzle of the animal. Now, we didn't show this entry to the participants. We showed 4 variants of the sign for wolf, and one of those was a reenactment of what was described in Long's publication. Now, that way people didn't have to think about other forms that they may have seen, and in that way didn't want to make it strictly a recall task. So this might be the case that someone who was very young was exposed to a grandparent or a much older individual that still used this compound sign of fangs and wolf, or fangs and muzzle to indicate wolf. Now, speaking for myself, I had never looked in a lot of these dictionaries, even though I taught sign language for many years. This wasn't a resource that I had used until quite recently. So the reason I choose this example is because Long says you have to start by referring to the fangs with both your hands on either side of your mouth, and then describe the muzzle. Now, most people today only use the reference to the muzzle. Again, we showed 4 images to participants, and most of them pointed to the sign with the muzzle, only the muzzle, as the one that was most familiar to them. No one pointed to this reenactment by the model, but a good number of people did this. And they didn't realize at all that that was a remnant of this old form from 1918 that Long described in his dictionary. It was no longer apparent to people. So even though we have this book that was published in Iowa, present-day Iowans aren't aware of this form, and even if they still use the form that references fangs, they didn't realize that it was connected to a slightly different, older form. And what's more, some participants recognized a reference to fangs as being a form that was used by a family, But they didn't realize that it was a form that used to be used by the community. They said, oh, well, there's that one family that will use that when they talk about wolves. So the point here is that it's not strictly schools that play a role in passing on language. Deaf families also have a role in passing on language over time. Now, as people age, sometimes we forget signs that we used to use when we were kids, or if we move to a new area, sometimes we forget about signs that we used to use in our home areas or regional dialects because we start to use a more national dialect, especially if you're in a place like Gallaudet where people come from all over. Now, we did another study where we interviewed pairs of siblings that were here at Gallaudet. So they're a younger generation cohort here in the Washington, D.C. region. We did the same sort of task, and there were some items where people would point to the same item, and in other cases, they would point to the other item. So this is why you see this divergent at around between items 6 and 10. The top chart were the ratings by an older generation cohort in Iowa, and the point here is the great degree of variety that is seen in the Iowa region. This is, for example, like people, going back to the wolf example, people could use just a reference to the muzzle, the fangs, a single fang, both fangs, and that all of that variety is tolerated when people move to a metropolitan area like Washington, D.C., and they're exposed to signers from all over, and the most readily understood sign is one that just references the muzzle. When they go back to Iowa, then it means that just that form ends up being used, even by the younger cohort there. Now, returning to the responses to the Swadesh word list, again, there were 100 items, and in seeing the first responses to the word list, we were able to then select a subset of the word list that really helped us to understand the variety that we were seeing. Now, of course, I started using the Swadesh word list just because it was what was already used in comparative linguistics. It's still available today. So these were English words that I used as elicitation prompts. And I was surprised to see that out of 100 signs on the, or 100 words on the word in the Swadesh word list, there was only one item where everybody, all 12 people, signed the same thing. On chart A were all of the items of the list of 100 where everyone signed the same thing. It includes pig, dance, year. In chart B, we see that 2 variants were in use. And how we coded for this was a little tricky because their forms would be related, but if they're not the same, then we coded them differently. So this also led me to understand just how difficult it can be and how dangerous it can be to use the Swadesh word list in examining a lexicon of a signing community. So those were examples from chart A, and chart B showed where there was a great deal of consistency. The one item from the word list that had the most variety was here on the bottom, right of chart D. It's for mountain. Almost everyone had their own version of it. I'll show you a couple here. There was so much variety for this one word. So is this a good word list if we want to maybe, for example, compare child language across regions? We know from administering the Swadesh word list that only those items in chart A were highly consistent in this one region, and we could then use these items to compare to a different region. I mean, this is a form of this would be a type of dialectology then, to really examine how different dialects around the nation. I'll show you a couple video clips of reenactments of responses that we got for night. Now, because here the movement was different, that there was a single contact, I coded that as a different form. And all of these are variants that we saw in use in Iowa. The last one was the one that was most different. Now, of course, it's a sign that we see in use to refer to something happening all night. But because the form was so different from the other three, it was coded as a different form. There was also a set of signs that were intentionally included for their movement as well as something that happened internal to that movement. So we wanted to see whether both the movement and that whatever the thing was that happens during the movement would be passed on. What we saw sometimes was that a weak, opaque feature was the one that was prone to deletion. The people who would retain both features were older adults. So the red bar is lower because it refers to the likelihood of reduction. Older people were less likely to reduce these forms. Younger people were more likely to reduce them. The forms we chose were crack, glossed as crack, measles. There are two forms of draw, one used by older and one used by younger adults. The form used by older adults that has a sort of swerving movement to it is rarely used. What we see more commonly among younger adults is this sign with the same location but a different internal movement. And then the same thing goes for grandmother, where we see that this repeated movement is deleted and it's only the direction remains and the distance remains. So we can see these sort of predictable deletions. And why is it that the second one is the one that is deleted in these forms for draw and grandmother, but it doesn't happen with something like crack? We know that there is something in the meaning when we refer to like a crack in the window. There's a meaning in that movement. People still understand that movement to have meaning, so it's retained in the word. The same thing with measles. The fact that the bumps or the inflammation, or the bumps are plural, then we know that that movement has to be retained, so it indicates that people understand that movement to have meaning, while in draw and grandmother, the movement isn't considered meaningful by young people anymore and is seen as arbitrary. We also did a study with people from Nebraska and found about 5 to 6 people per family. We had 2 different families and 5 to 6 subjects per family responding to the same stimulus material. The forms that they used for these 5 dictionary entries were different family to family, but were the same within the family. We saw that for the dictionary entry of roll or donut, the same form was used by all members in both families. But for people, we saw that while the hand shape, location, and movement were the same, the direction of the movement differed between the 2 families. For the sign glossed as leaf, we saw a difference in the 2 families only with the aperture of their fingers. One family used an open hand, another family used a closed hand. Also in plate, we saw that the dictionary entry included a form that had the thumb and index finger extended, but one family had their middle finger and thumb used to show the shape of the plate, while the other family traced the shape of a plate on the weak hand. Now, further within the family, not only were was one family's hand shape the same, some of the movement might be different across the younger generation. So their non-dominant hand would stay static, their dominant hand could move to make reference to plural plates. We also saw a difference in how they signed ladder. And there's one family here, the one depicted on the left, that uses a form that's the same as mine. And the image on the right is not a form that I use, so I have a harder time reenacting that one. I'm guessing that maybe this family had a ladder in their home or something and was able to use a ladder more often, and that's what led them to have an animate legged classifier on ladder, which was represented as a size and shape specifier. So all of these are ways to investigate our lexicon and show that it is passed down across generations, and that there is a great deal of consistency within one generation, even though there can be variety across generations. But if it's passed down within a single family, there is a higher degree of consistency generation to generation. So this isn't surprising that there's a great deal of consistency within a family. This also should allow us to predict what changes will happen. On this chart, take a look at the items that are marked in purple. These are forms that were really only unique to a familial dialect. Those on the bottom quarter of this graph were items that really there was no lexical consistency for, and so people ended up relying on finger spelling when they were presented with those items. So when I agreed to do the lecture, I said that it would be about grammaticalization because I knew that discourse is very important in early sign languages, or the genesis of a language as a sign language community forms, and that over time the community will develop their own syntax. That syntax may borrow to some degree from English, but in American Sign Language we had French Sign Language that was imported to the United States. So we were able to keep some of the same paradigms and patterns that they used in LSF. So we see that there's robust continuity of patterns once it's understood by a signing community. So that means that we start to share the same template for a word. And this is what can give way to some of the variety that we see, even though they all stem from the same paradigm. This indicates that our mental lexicon is really storing these paradigms. And as younger people come across more variation, they choose a segment from the same paradigm, perhaps reducing different parts of it. So it is children that start driving the change that we see in language, which is a common story of language change. And this is an aspect of grammaticalization, that we go from discourse to syntax to morphology, and then even to clitics. So you would not expect to see clitics in the early years of a signed language or any language. It's an important principle to understand that you will only see clitics in very mature languages. So I'd like to close with revisiting the topic of simultaneity in signed languages. And even more important than that, I'd also like to think about what we think defines a good sign. Many of us have interacted with interpreters who ask for a single sign for a word or a concept because they're dealing with the challenge of interpreting. And when I try to give them a phrase for how I would express a concept, I'm often met with resistance because they want a single sign and they don't feel that they have time to use these phrases if there's a single word used in English. And this is sort of replicating what Higgins did in his dictionary even 100 years ago, where he had this one-to-one correspondence between words and signs. But we see that having single forms, or what feels like single forms, are only the result of having an evolution of a phrase. So new concepts still have to start as phrases. Now, you could say that one word has multiple syllables, or be polysyllabic, or have a single syllable, monosyllabic, constituting a consonant vowel made up of a consonant, vowel, and consonant. So there are languages that are made up of monosyllabic segments, others where their words are polysyllabic. I'll show you this same chart that represents spoken languages, because I think that we have become sort of overly fixated on simultaneity and modality and the visual properties of sign language, but there are different types of signs that we have in our lexicon, that some of which would have been used 100 years ago, some of which are the result of change that has been going on for over 200 years. So even in modern day ASL, we have old forms and we have new forms. And this diagram is one way of representing the variety of word types that we have in current use. So not only can words or signs be mono or polysyllabic, they can also be made up of a variety of morphemes. They can be monomorphemic or polymorphemic. You can have a single sign that has multiple components that are formed with our individual hands or movements, and this would lead us to have something like a classifier predicate, which is polymorphemic but monosyllabic. Opaque lexemes are words that we now see as having single morphemes and being composed of single syllables. For example, never. I showed you earlier that it's a single movement, but it's actually, I would argue, a cliticized polyword, because we don't even see it as being a byproduct or the result of evolution happening to a compound of always and a negation. We see it as a single sign, when really, if we look diachronically, we see that it was formed of two words. And I'll skip over the one slide that I'm sure you just saw with a bunch of text, to show another form of this same graph that contrasts with how I see the lexicon of American Sign Language. So sign languages, all sign languages of the world, were deemed by Diane Brentari, who's a very well-known phonologist, as being monosyllabic and polymorphemic. So while she recognizes that there are signs that are made up of multiple morphemes, she regards them as being monosyllabic. So this is also an indication of a view of sign language as though it is simultaneous, because many things are in a single sign, and so it leads to the assumption that all sign languages would be monosyllabic and simultaneous, which stands in contrast to English, which is viewed as monomorphemic and polysyllabic, or West Greenlandic, which is viewed as polymorphemic and polysyllabic. Now, if you were to strictly look at dictionary entries, like what we saw in the Higgins book, where there was a one-to-one correspondence of signs and words, then of course that would lead you to this conclusion that signs can be polymorphemic and monosyllabic, but dictionaries don't represent the entirety of our lexicon. I think that I suggest that one way we can re-understand sign languages is to not limit ourselves to looking at sign language or all sign languages as fitting into one of these quadrants, but also taking into account the age of a given sign language and understanding which word types you should expect to see in a younger language and what you would only expect to see over time. So in a very new language, you would expect to see polymorphemic polysyllabic items that form words through compounding. Over time, they would become a cliticized polyword, and with further evolution, they would become opaque lexemes, which are generally the items that are much easier to put into a dictionary. And while those dictionaries are important, I think that it can lead phonologists to not really recognize what it is that led these signs to have the meanings that they do, which really comes from looking at the historical origins of those frozen lexemes. So again, this is my attempt to try to organize all of the data that I've come across in the most recent years of my work. And I know some of you in the audience today have linguistic backgrounds, psycholinguistic, neuroscience, sociolinguistic backgrounds, and might bring each of those forms of education to bear on this topic. So remember that when I talk about lexicon, I'm not talking about simply a list of dictionary entries or a one-to-one correspondence between a spoken language or a written language and a sign language. I mean that I want us to understand the lexicon of our sign language and how it's evolved over time, and that they often are the result of our linguistic and cognitive scaffolding that has persisted over time by way of morphology. Now, this can lead us to having a model for how we understand the evolution of signs. And I should point out that I'm not talking about predictable variation or variation that exists among non-native users or L2 users of sign language, but predictable variation that we would expect to see in the language and what types of change we can predict would happen. Just sort of like the other example I gave, and it's escaping me now. Oh, right, the example of removing the plural marker for test, or how the one family signs plate and how the younger generation changed the formation of their sign so that they can inflect it for plural markers. We can also maybe predict how a lexicon would change based on who teaches a language. And I'd also like to point out that we don't know which sign was the right sign to put into a dictionary. We really are dependent on the lexicographer's decisions, and so we can only make judgments based on what's in the dictionary, but we don't necessarily know all of the variations that were in use at the time. So we know that L2 approaches sometimes filter what we know about our languages. And for this reason, I think it's important that we start to understand ASL as a heritage language, to look at the broader scope of all that ASL is and our community, including different generations, so that we're not only focusing on people who are maybe in their 20s to 40s, but also to understand the language that's used by seniors and also the youngest members of our community. People are now thinking about creating programs or spaces for users of a community to go, and I think that in the reality that we're facing of having many schools for deaf children close, we need to think about alternate ways for our community to come together to encourage natural acquisition. And as neuroscientists, we know that as we age, our minds, our cognitive capacities change, not only because of aging, but because of things that happen like strokes. This is another thing, while it seems like it's ripe for research, it can be it can be dangerous to look at older individuals and measure their language production or language comprehension post-stroke, because you don't quite know what their mental lexicon was pre-stroke. With that, I'll close by acknowledging some of my collaborators. Matt Malzkuhn did a great deal of work as a research assistant traveling to Iowa to collect data. Gabriel Arellano and Tori Sampson also did a great deal of work. Don Metley helped build the historical sign language database. This was work that was funded by the NSF, so I have to thank the NSF for their support. And I've got this page of references that's available. I can share this with anyone in the room who's interested. And I didn't have time to show you the massive open online course that was mentioned in the introduction, and neither did I have time to open up the database, but I thought I would include the URL so that you could access it. If anyone is interested in taking the MOOC, it's currently archived. We're going to make some refinements and we'll relaunch it next year. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was a just absolutely riveting presentation. I'd also like to, sorry if you don't mind me using your podium here. I'd like to thank William H., the William H. and Ruth Crane Schaefer Endowment for their support for today's lecture. Before we proceed with the Q&A, I would like to make 2 housekeeping remarks. First, the PhD program in Educational Neuroscience has a questionnaire. Did I sign that right? Which form should I use? Survey, questionnaire? For all of you in the room to fill out.
So not a test.
Right, not a test, not an exam, just a questionnaire. And at the end of the Q&A time, please do join us over in the SLCC for a reception with our special invited guest. We have time for maybe 3 questions. Thank you.
I guess I'll stand right here. Hello, I really appreciated your lecture. Thank you so much for this crash course on linguistics, psycholinguistics, anthropology, history. Wow, I really enjoyed what you covered. Not just looking at a short moment in time, but going back into history, seeing what happened at those moments, as well as different contributions from other countries, looking at documentation in print as well as video. That's a really good opportunity to cross-reference. The dictionaries were most likely printed for those who were learning sign language and kind of slowly picking up sign by sign. However, the videos and those targeted audiences were those who were deaf or could sign more fluently. And to see that range between the published work is really interesting. And what we see today with hearing people and what they use and how to marry that with other things. It's also asking families, other families, deaf families, to see if they would sign differently if they were signing to a hearing person, or someone, a newer signer or a more fluent signer. So I'm curious about just recently the ASL dictionary that was just recently published within the past couple years, and comparing those to dictionaries in the past. And again, those dictionaries are mostly for new learners or non-native users. And so really honing in, or being interested in honing in on those mothers who sign with their babies, and how we change our signing depending on who we're communicating with.
I think some of what you're addressing here is register. And I don't really delve too much into that. I do look a great deal at dialect, but I know that register also gets a great deal of interest, and that we do certainly modify how we sign depending on who we're talking to. You sort of have a lot of questions wrapped up in one with what you just talked about. So just to address part of what you've brought up, I think that typical signers, just everyday people, sometimes referred to as grassroots signers, do have different signs that they use or choose depending on the situation. So obviously in a case where we're going over, where there's someone who's not from their community, asking them how they sign things, that might elicit a certain response. This is why we really sort of explored not only what people use, but what they know, what they've seen. We know that from the NAD videos, or the NAD films, that there was methodical and colloquial language that was already in use. And the tension between the two, and disagreement over the value of each of them, is what led the NAD to make those films. So there was a difference of opinion about which signs were appropriate to use, and they made these films to show the formal, appropriate versions, recognizing that the colloquial signs were okay just to use in the community. Really, this was just an indication of language change between older people and younger people, and that's often what gives way to what is seen as higher register and a more informal register. And I think that modern dictionaries would show what's acceptable today, which could be different from what was acceptable decades ago.
If I could add one more. I'm wondering if we should have different categories, like as you had talked about with polysemous words and those different meanings. You know, your face and your hand shapes. You know, we have those categories now. For example, with the alphabet ABCs.
Well, you're bringing up actually a lot already, and I would rather have something online where all of it is available and someone could sign something, let that be there, let that exist online, and as people access it, they could show their sign for that item, and in that way create a bank of words that are in use. We know that in the Gallaudet library there is a great deal of video footage that's available from decades where people have different types of language use. Some of it's more colloquial or informal, some of it's formal. I don't know that our language is quite to the point where it could be machine readable yet, but it would be great if we were to make plans for building a way or a repository for this language. I think another sort of dangerous way of thinking is to make dictionaries intended for wide audiences that don't fully understand the intent. For example, the WFD published a dictionary of international signs, and this leads people to think that there are single signs for concepts when that's not the nature of international communication. And it also raises issues of recognizing certain dialects and devaluing others, creating competition among dialects. So I think that the creation of dictionaries, while well-intentioned, can often have unintended negative consequences.
Hello, that was a fabulous presentation. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed watching your lecture. I'm from Washington State. I flew here for a few days to spend some time in DC and wanted to come up here and see your presentation. My question is somewhat related, a little bit off topic from your lecture, but you got me thinking about newer signs, which, and you had mentioned newer signs become more popular with those who mainstream, or within the mainstream. So, for example, the signs for the word autism and language deprivation. I've noticed that there's quite a variation in signs for those two words. There's not a lot of consistency. So as it has started in its infancy and develops, will it become more consistent, or will it become more strongly regionalized? I'm curious what you think about that in the relation to those two signs and two words.
It's a really good question. I'm sure it also relates to policy and planning and language planning. By the way, you said that you were from Washington State. I'm from Washington State too. I grew up in Washington.
Oh, okay.
Maybe
Cool.
that's why I often find myself feeling so different than, or taking a different stance than others do. So, to address your question, I think you have to start with thinking about situations prompting need. So a new situation prompts a need for new language. And it may be that people that are more familiar with the concept have ways of referring to the concept, and people just don't look at ways that a community might already refer to something, because it might not be that there's a single sign that relates to a word that people are looking for, but when you look at the overall context, then you'll see that they're referring to a certain concept. So you have to look at natural processes of how communities talk about, say, the two terms that you brought up. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that, with using something like discursive ways of referring to a concept, especially if it's a new concept. There's nothing wrong with that. It'll evolve into a phrase and over time become a more standardized form. There's also, I think, an insufficient understanding of dialectology, partly because of signs that got sort of privileged or preferred over others, and so these other signs that weren't used didn't become part of a national dialect. Now, when you talked about mainstream, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to by that. Are you talking about the desire to push for a standard dialect?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so not meaning like educational practices at all, just sort of deaf mainstream. Okay, just wanted that was what I thought you meant. But
Correct, just the general mainstream, yes.
Got it. Okay, I didn't want to misunderstand you. Just sort of what naturally happens in a signing community, you're going to start with variety in a single community where people come from all over. But then as one community gets formed, you can tolerate more variation. When you constantly have a heterogeneity of a community like you do here in DC, you're going to end up needing a great deal of consistency so that people can understand each other. And I think that we need a great deal more work on that. Thank you for your question.
We'd like to share this gift with you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation.
Please join us at SLCC. Thanks again for the reception.